Let's turn to the parable of the unforgiving servant. A few verses before this parable begins, there's a question about what to do if someone at church offends you. Then Peter asks, if someone trespasses against me, how many times do I need to forgive them? It's in the context of being offended by someone at church and forgiving others that Christ gives this parable. Let's approximate how much money we're going to be talking about in the parable. The King James Version refers to pennies and talents, and those aren't monetary units we're familiar with. The word we have as a penny was a denarius. That would be about 1 day's wages for a common laborer. For round numbers, let's assume that today a minimum wage for a day's work is about $100. 1 talent equaled 6,000 pennies. That would be about $600,000 or 25 years worth of wages. With those two figures in mind, we can better approximate the different amounts discussed in this parable. The first servant owes his master 10,000 talents. That would be 164,000 years worth of wages or $6 billion. A second servant owes the first servant 100 pence, which would be 100 days' wages, about $10,000. That's still a substantial amount of money, but nothing in comparison to what the first servant owes. Jesus begins the parable saying, when the king began to reckon, one was brought unto him, which owed him 10,000 talents. If you're a first century listener, you already know this is crazy. If a story begins with someone owed another person $6 billion, you know there's no possible way to repay that debt. But the servant fell down and said, Lord, have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. The master is merciful. The entire debt is forgiven. Then the first servant encounters the second servant who owes him the equivalent of $10,000 and says, give me what you owe me. Notice how the second servant does exactly what the first servant did. He falls down at the first servant's feet and says the exact same phrase, have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. But the first servant doesn't forgive. He casts the second servant into prison. When the king hears about this, he says to the first servant, O thou wicked servant, I forgave thee all that debt because thou desirest me. Shouldst not thou also have had compassion on thy fellow servant, even as I had pity on thee? Christ concludes the parable saying, his Lord was wroth and delivered him to the tormentors, till he should pay all that was due unto him. So likewise shall my heavenly Father do also unto you, if ye from your hearts forgive not every one his brother their trespasses. The message of this parable is obvious. We must forgive. A key to driving this parable into our hearts is to ask ourselves, if I were really forgiven $6 billion, would I forgive someone else 10,000? Those numbers are so astronomical that maybe we could change it slightly. Imagine that your wealthy friend drives a Ferrari and lets you take it for a spin. You're not paying attention while you're driving and you wreck the Ferrari. Your generous friend says, don't worry about it. Later that day, someone breaks the pencil you loaned them. If your friend forgave you for wrecking the Ferrari, you could certainly forgive a broken pencil. In other words, in this parable, we're the first servant. Jesus is in essence forgiving us $6 billion worth of sin, so we can turn around and forgive someone who owes us $10,000 worth of sin. I love how Christian leaders Timothy and Kathy Keller frame this idea. They refer to Christ on the cross saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And write, if you see Jesus dying on the cross for others, forgiving the people who killed him, that can be just a crushing example of forgiving love that you will never be able to live up to. But if instead you see Jesus dying on the cross for you, forgiving you, putting away your sin, that changes everything. The joy and freedom that comes from knowing that the Son of God did that for you enables you to do the same for others. We might encounter some really challenging circumstances when it's almost impossible to forgive. We could feel like someone has sinned a $10 billion sin against us. Remember what Elder Jeffrey R. Holland taught.
He did not say, you're not allowed to feel true pain or real sorrow from the shattering experiences you've had at the hand of another. Nor did he say, in order to forgive fully, you have to re-enter a toxic relationship or return to an abusive, destructive circumstance. But notwithstanding, even the most terrible offenses that might come to us, we can rise above our pain only when we put our feet onto the path of true healing. That path is the forgiving one walked by Jesus of Nazareth, who calls out to each of us, come, follow me.
To see more videos like this one, simply search Seeking Jesus.